Thanks, Dr. Zubair, for your talk. I think if one were to summarize that, so to get isolated hypoxia in patients with acute and chronic liver failure is uncommon. Oftentimes, you will have other things also coming up into the clinical picture of a given patient, generally by way of poor hemodynamics, renal dysfunction, the need for fluids/slash transfusion in the preoperative period, and basically, when you're talking of hypoxia, I would probably like to say that one could just focus on the acute lung injury component of the syndrome rather than the other causes of hypoxia that you can see in a cirrhotic patient. Those, of course, would be having different connotations for a transplant patient. Now, you said that if your patient's oxygenation gets better, so do you think it will just be the blood gas value, or would you also be looking at the radiologic improvement? Because that is something which is a little tricky in the ITU rounds when you have a patient who's been posted for transplant. So you know the two might not always go hand in hand.
Absolutely, sir. I hope I'm audible. Now,
Yes, you are.
it is,
Yeah.
yeah. So, it is true that one of the primary markers that we'll be looking at is the etiology for getting intubated, i.e., what is the cause of hypoxia. Now, if you are able to correct that, which is most of a lot of time fluid overload in these patients, and sometimes along with acute kidney injury, degree of injury replacement to some of these patients. Now, oxygenation, sorry, the PO2 by FiO2 ratio, the blood gas parameters would be the primary marker that I look for, especially when they're in a fluid overload state. However, if factor definitely make more vary regarding going ahead with the transplant. For the ones for whom fluid overload was a pathology, yes, oxygenation would be the primary criteria. As far as radiological parameters are concerned, they do sometimes take a few more days to get better, but I wouldn't wait it for to be a pristine lung as long as we know that the trend is improving. We might have a lower threshold. But having said that, we all know that once they get intubated, the prognosis is poor, and especially in a living donor setting, we know that we have to really tread a thin line before we take a living donor for transplanting ACLF. Well, usually when they get intubated, they go into pure isolated ACLF2 who gets intubated. If it's volume overload, then they would get a preference also.
Any role of FOB as you prepare these patients for transplant?
Again, depends upon the etiology of hypoxia. So if we feel that if it is fluid overload, then probably we send a bronchoalveolar lavage to look for inflammatory, look for infective factors associated with it. Clearly, if it's pneumonia that's causing this problem, yeah, fiber optic bronchoscopy, try to get the bronchoalveolar samples and look for cultures would be something that would go straight away.
Right. So I think this is a tricky part for us, at least in our program. The lungs are the overriding concern. So amongst all organ failure scores, I think the lung score weighs the maximum. And if the lungs are not on your side, probably one would tend to levitate away from a transplant in this patient till such time he can get so much better, because we know that positive pressure ventilation by itself can be a little misleading in these patients, and that might give you a false sense of security. But again, theater is some place where you will lose count of the quantum of fluids given, including blood products, and that can make the recovery really go to the other end of the spectrum. So I think amongst all organ failure scores, for us probably the lung score would be the most vital. And if the patient is hypoxic, and because there are no set criteria for what would be a good PO2 to FiO2 ratio in these patients. So what would you stop at? 200, 150, 100, or will you just see the trend? It's really difficult to assess that in the presence of a patient who's mechanically ventilated, because the triggers also are always a little bit difficult to be very dogmatic about. So whether it's just fluid overload or whether there is also some component of lower respiratory tract infection, What about those who've been treated with steroids? Again, not uncommon. What about those who've received plasma exchange? Again, something which is practiced fairly commonly in our country. So what is the effect of trolley? So all of these things, they make decision making in this situation rather difficult. And at least in our program, we are a little reluctant to transplant patients who've got iffy lungs. All other organ failures would be acceptable, but this is one thing that we would really be very, very careful about. So thanks so much.
Yeah, just to,
Yeah,
yeah, that's what you said. Once they get intubated, usually there might be that AC left 2 when they get intubated, but as you said, in the next few days, it's quite very common to see them rapidly progress to AC left 3.
Yeah.
Or 4 more organ failures, which even preclude them from getting.
Yeah. So
there's
so many things happening, you know. So
absolutely.
Once they get ventilated, then whatever the hemodynamics are, they take a hit. The urine output takes a hit for obvious reasons, you know. Even though partly that would be driven by your ventilatory support, but they generally do lead to a deterioration. So there is collateral damage to other organ systems too, and therefore iffy lungs, at least in our program, are a no call for a transplant. So other organ failures we could still argue in an MDT, but if the lungs are bad, then probably we would not take these patients for transplant. Thank you so much, Dr. Zubair, and we move on to the last talk in this session, and that talk is going to be delivered by Dr. Anup Warrior. He is an infectious disease physician, and he works at Aster Healthcare, and he'll be talking to us about transplant in an ACLF situation and someone who's got a blood culture positive report. Dr. Anup, please.
Good evening, Doctor. Just give me a moment to share the screen. Thank you. I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Well, good evening all. And to start with, just a initiating thing that the bacteremic sepsis in this condition of liver failure is known to have quite a very high mortality. So about 45% is what is being shown in most of the reports. And interestingly, if the liver failure patients sometimes do not mount a febrile response, and hence screening cultures are often sent to see the reason for deterioration. And for a patient who's afebrile and bacteremic, they tend to have higher mortality. So that was again an interesting point for me. However, when we look at the mortality from the liver disease itself, surprisingly, it is more than sepsis. So sepsis mortality in a bacteremic patient was about 45, but mortality from Southeast Asia and South Asia, it's more than 50% for the liver failure. So I perfectly understand that we need to consider going for an early transplantation. So we need to get rid of the sepsis as fast as possible and initiate the transplantation process. And that's why we are into this topic, and that's why we want to understand that if your screening culture is positive, what do you do and when you can take up that patient for a safe transplant. So I did a reasonable review of literature from Google, PubMed and all, and I did not find nothing much on this this particular question, like, you know, somebody is culture positive and when do you take him up for transplant. So I have tried to arrive at an approach answering these 4 questions, and I have looked at evidence which would help me answer these 4 questions. So first is, what sort of bug is isolated? What is the culture report showing? This is because typically there are a couple of bugs who have a risk of dissemination and relapse. Okay, so these needs to be looked differently than the other bugs. The second question I would like to answer is, what would be my best therapeutic option? Because appropriate adequate therapy is something which determines the clearance, cure, and hence our ability to take up the patient for transplant on an early basis. Should I repeat the blood cultures to prove clearance is something again which I wanted to understand. So is it okay that I just give antibiotic for 5 days, 7 days and I clear? Or should I insist that no, after 3 days, 4 days, repeat a blood culture? I want to see a negative blood culture before I give clearance for the transplant. And the fourth question finally was, how long should I treat before clearing for the transplant after all these reviews? So let us take these questions one by one. First question is about the blood culture isolate based considerations. So these are the 5 common scenarios which we see in a culture positive sepsis. We have the Enterobacteriaceae group, that is your E. coli, Klebsiella, etc. So we know that most of them are XDRs, carbapenem resistant bugs. So we have a couple of newer antibiotics. We take the help of genotyping or molecular typing to sort of select the best drug out of this. However, we also realize that there is sometimes a difficulty to eradicate if they have very chronic cystitis, sometimes biofilm mediated infections like an AV fistula related, or they have a catheter inside, etc. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, again, just like Acinetobacter, these two also we have multi-drug resistant bugs. Difficulty in treating because newer antibiotics are not much effective against these, so we have difficulty in getting to appropriate therapy when we isolate these. Staph aureus and Enterococcus, these are special because these two bugs have this propensity for dissemination and relapse. So the Staph aureus typically disseminates into spine and the heart walls, and the Enterococcus typically disseminates into the heart walls, causing endocarditis, and hence these might necessitate much more longer therapy than the rest. So even though not very commonly practiced, I try to look up what is the best way to screen for dissemination for these two bugs, the Staph aureus and Enterococcus. If they are isolated, what would you do to screen whether they have any dissemination? So there are practically what we do is we repeat the cultures, we do echoes, but the literature wise, the ideal one for dissemination is actually FDG PET-CT. So in this review published this year, it was found that it identifies the primary infection focus, that is usually a spine infection or an endocarditis in more than half the patients with bloodstream infection of unknown origin when it is from Staph aureus. And it was also found that if you have a clear FDG PET, which is not showing any discitis or not showing endocarditis, 2 weeks treatment is sufficient for a patient who has isolated Staph aureus from his blood. Similarly, for endocarditis, the prevalence for Enterococcus, the prevalence for endocarditis has been quite high in the literature. About a quarter of these persistent bacteremias for Enterococcus actually have endocarditis. But can you screen everybody for endocarditis? There were some few high-risk conditions identified. If Enterococcus is the only isolate which is growing repeatedly in the blood culture, if the patient has got a prosthetic valve, if it is community onset bloodstream infection, that means the patient did not have a hospital admission for last 3 months, and people of male sex, these were high risk identified in this review. There is also something called as a NOVA score, primarily which looked at the number of positive blood cultures. So if you have 3 sets of blood cultures growing Enterococcus, straight away the risk of enterococcal bacterium is very high, and you should go for a transesophageal echo screening instead of a transthoracic echo in these people. Similarly, unknown origin of bacterium, that is primary bacteremia with Enterococcus, nothing from urine, nothing from bile, just blood growing Enterococcus, again is a high risk to screen for endocarditis. So the second part is about the targeted treatment. So once we know that the first part about looking at dissemination, so we know that 2 bugs, Staph aureus and Enterococcus, are notorious for dissemination. Endocarditis screening is something what we get to do in these, and if possible, feasible, PET-CT is supposed to be the best. Coming to the next part, that is targeted treatment. From where we started with blood cultures, then positive blood culture, and then Vitek identification and susceptibility, which used to take 2 to 3 days. All of us, or many of us, in fact, have the ability to do a multiplex PCR or a rapid identification along with drug susceptibility from the gram stain itself. So in the first 12 to 24 hours, if you have a positive blood culture, the bottle flashes positive, you can do a direct multiplex PCR from a BioFire system or a GeneXpert Carby, etc., and identify the bug and also give you the resistant mechanism. So why is this important? It helps you get to appropriate therapy fast, helps you clear the bug fast, and helps you reach the transplant time fast. Just a rapid look at 2 examples. So this is carbapenem resistant Klebsiella, and if your the molecular typing shows NDM, which is common in our scenario, you can give ceftazidime avibactam along with aztreonam, or you have an option of fosfomycin. The other drugs which are written there are not available in India. I am not going to read through that, but you have an option of ceftazidime avibactam plus aztreonam or fosfomycin. Oxa 48 is also pretty much seen in our country. You have plain ceftazidime avibactam as an option for that. So this is how molecular typing helps for your Klebsiella. So for Pseudomonas aeruginosa, in the similar fashion, If it detects carbamazepine, again you have an option of ceftazidime avibactam. The other options like imipenem and ceftazolone tazobactam are not available for Pseudomonas. Fosfomycin in combination plus minus aminoglycoside, which offer obviously for liver failure, not a favorite drug, but fosfomycin is something which you can consider also in this setting. So the third question which I wanted to address was, do we need to repeat the cultures to document clearance? So this is a review from last year, which sort of came to a conclusion that there are certain risk factors which mandate repeat blood cultures because they are at high risk for persistence of bacteremia. So what are the risk factors for persistence of bacteremia beyond 2 to 3 days after you start the antibiotic? A critically ill patient by itself, any endovascular source of infection. If the isolate is a MDR pathogen and you could not hit the target right when you started empiric therapy, somebody with an end-stage renal disease and immunodeficiency. So now your patient who is acute and chronic liver failure would meet all these criteria. They could be critically ill, they would have isolated MDR, they are immunodeficient. So this means that most of them would require actually a repeat follow-up blood culture. So in the same document, they gave two aspects to this. You can decide based on the microbiological factors. The green says that you need to do the follow-up cultures and the red says where you need not do. So I'll just pick up and talk about the red. So the only scenario where you need not do a repeat blood culture, if it is an antibiotic susceptible pathogen, that is not an MDR, and your empiric therapy itself was appropriate, right? On the left side, what effective therapy in the preceding 24 hours. So you start the antibiotic, the culture grows later, 24 hours, 48 hours, and you see that it is a perfect match, then maybe you can avoid. But more importantly, looking at the clinical features, if you focus on this, we will understand that almost any ACLF patient who has a blood culture positivity will mandate a repeat culture. So here, if you look at the columns in red, that is where you can avoid a follow-up culture. It is very, very limited. If there is no eradicable source and the PCT CRPs are negative and it is not an intra-abdominal source, so these are the scenarios where you can avoid a repeat blood culture. This happens rarely. So for all practical purposes, we end up with that you need to repeat the blood cultures and document a clearance for this set of patients. The last question from my side was the treatment duration and when do you clear for the transplant. There is no hard evidence regarding how long you should treat a bloodstream infection in a critically ill patient. So no randomized control trials, no prospective cohort data. We have some expert statement from last year intensive care medicine. It says that 5 to 7 days should suffice with a negative follow blood culture. So you start the antibiotics, you get the blood culture, you positive, you see the isolate. If your initial antibiotic is appropriate, day 3, repeat the blood culture because follow blood culture is required as we had explained earlier. Day 5 or 7, the repeat blood culture is negative and the patient is clinically recovered, you might be able to stop the antibiotic in this subset. This is the only literature evidence which I could find out regarding clearance to a patient who is septic. This was published in Transplantation in March 2021. And they pointed out to only 2 scenarios as a contraindication for active transplant. A severely frail patient with persistent fever. So somebody who is critically ill with persistent fever. So you need an afebrile patient for 24 hours or so before you consider transplant. And you need to give at least 72 hours of appropriate antibiotic before you consider for the transplant. So the patient needs to be afebrile for 24 hours. You need to give at least 3 days of appropriate antibiotic therapy. And by the virtue of the previous publication which I showed you, you need at least 1 negative blood culture. So to summarize what we discussed, certain high-risk pathogens like Staph aureus and Enterococcus, you need to screen for dissemination before you declare them cured and fit for transplantation. Primarily endocarditis in this group. We have systematic reviews which show that these 2 pathogens have a high risk of dissemination and it might be worth screening them before we take it on for a major surgery like transplant. We need to ensure that we follow up the blood cultures and document clearance in this group of patients because as per the systematic reviews, all of them are at a high risk for persistence or relapse of these bacteremias. The last is that the minimum duration of treatment is 3 to 5 days with a targeted therapy, but this is based on expert opinion and consensus statement. And we can hit the targeted therapy by using molecular diagnostics, which will give you personalized antibiotic choices. Thank you. I'm open up for any questions, Dr. Dharmesh.
Thank you, Dr. Anup. That was a wonderful talk. So I was just wondering, the situation in patients with liver disease is a little difficult. You mentioned the word sepsis. So many of our patients, they would have white cell counts which are well within the normal range. They might not have the SIRS criteria. And those of us who do a fair bit of deceased donor transplants, it's not uncommon to call the donor when you have a possible organ available. You find that the patient is say having a temperature of say 99, and oftentimes, and I think in many programs it's customary to send off cultures even from the OR if your patient was not febrile. When you put in the lines and when you catheterize the patient and when you open the abdomen, at least in our program we've been doing that for over 2 decades. So it's customary to send off a blood culture, a urine culture, an acetic fluid right from the theater. So what happens if the patient grows a positive bug when you've already taken a call? So what do you think would be the approach in a situation like that? So this patient didn't have anything that you could suspect while this patient was being wheeled into the OR, but after this patient's surgery has been initiated, you find that the lab comes back and tells you that this patient is growing a bug. What would be the approach in a situation like that?
So the only option for us is to get to targeted therapy as quick as possible, because what would save the patient from post-operative sepsis and this mortality is appropriate therapy as early as possible. So if you have grown something, say 24 hours after surgery or 48 hours after surgery, the present molecular test which I showed you, like the BioFire BCID systems, they give you the identification and they give you the antibiotic resistance profile in terms of molecular mechanisms in a span of 1 hour. So if the blood cultures flags positive, within an hour, you know that this is the bug and you know that this is the potential resistance mechanism, and hence you can hit the appropriate antibiotic as soon as possible. So that's the only sort of way ahead, and so that we ensure the adequate therapy as early as possible in this group.
Right. So I think that point is well taken, because these decisions are extremely difficult in patients with end-stage liver disease or acute and chronic liver failure patients. So you would not always have the best case scenario when you take up these patients for transplant. And I think the only other thing to add would be how smoothly the surgery goes on, the use of transfusion products, and then the fact that you could modulate their immunosuppression to get a favorable outcome. But I think the point that needs to be emphasized is what you mentioned about the 2 bugs which have got a potential to seed other organs, and that is something that we should all be very aware of, because at times we would not pay attention to that. So you cannot breathe easy just because the patient is afebrile and you got a culture positive from one of the samples sent from the OR, because you never know what happens when these patients are taken off the ventilator or when you put the pedal on immunosuppression. So thank you so much. If there are any questions, I don't see Dr. Swine here, but anyone who's logged in, I don't see any questions in the chat box also. Anyone would have any comment to make or a question to us, please feel free to do that. If not, then we go to the next session. So I thank all the speakers for their wonderful presentations, and we bring this session to an end. Back to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next topic is state-of-the-art lectures, liver transplantation in alcoholic hepatitis. Should live donor liver transplant criteria differ from dead donor liver transplant? The chairperson for the topic is Dr. Sanjeev Sehgal, Principal Director, Hepatology and Liver Transplant Medicine, Max Hospital, Delhi. He has an experience in dealing with more than 3,500 liver transplants, received numerous awards including Calcutta University Gold Medal, National Pfizer Award, Human Care Award 2018. The speaker for the topic is Shivkumar Saran. I request Dr. Cyriac Abi-Philip, who is a senior consultant in the Department of Clinical and Translational Hepatology at the Liver Institute, Rajagiri Hospital, Alua, to please introduce the speaker. Sir, please.
I would like to thank the organizers of the Indian Society of Organ Transplantation 2021 for giving me this unique and humbling opportunity to introduce the next speaker. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Shiv Sarin, a perfect example of the clinician scientist, and if I may proudly add, my teacher, mentor, and guide in the intriguing and remarkable clinical practice that is hepatology. Professor Sarin is currently Senior Professor and Head, Department of Hepatology and Director, Institute of Liver and Biliary Sciences, New Delhi, and Adjunct Professor of Molecular Medicine at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and Honorary Professor, Jawaharlal Center for Advanced Scientific Research. A pioneer in hepatology, Professor Sarin has contributed immensely to the field of liver diseases. As a recipient of the European Association for the Study of Liver Recognition Award in 2015, Professor Sarin's works were instrumental in improving the management of portal hypertension, which include band ligation for the primary prevention of variceal bleeding and classification and management of gastric varices, the latter named after him. His pioneering work, along with a group of experts towards defining and managing the catastrophic syndrome of acute and chronic liver failure, escalated the Asia Pacific Association for the Study of Liver, of which he is the chairman of the steering committee, to a formidable position in the field of critical care hepatology on the international stage. Professor Sarin is a visionary beyond compare, and it is this distinction that lay the path-breaking groundwork for the role of regenerative medicine in patients with advanced liver disease and modulation of gut microbiota for severe alcohol-associated hepatitis, both of which came from his internationally acclaimed disruptive clinical research lab at ILBS. With close to 400 publications just in the last decade and an H-index of 104, Professor Sarin is a gifted teacher and mentor that every student needs and deserves. For his intense dedication, vision and work, and for being a role model for the country, he was bestowed with the Padma Bhushan by the Government of India. As a 21st century doctor, our responsibility does not stop at using the available resources, but also extends to making a contribution to these resources ourselves. This unconditional contribution towards ever-growing evidence-based medicine can only happen if physicians become clinician scientists who are competent enough to incorporate basic science research into clinical practice, thereby improving the healthcare in society and the scientific tempo of the nation. Professor Sarin is the original visionary that started this movement in India, and I pray and hope his tribe increase. I now hand over proceedings to the Honorable Chairperson for furthering the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and it's absolutely my pleasure, delight, and a fortunate moment to again, thank you, sir, Professor Sarin, for agreeing to deliver this very important state-of-art lecture. And I may add here that I have been a student of Professor Sarin at one stage, and I continue to be inspired by him for all his wonderful works which he is doing all the time. And we look forward to your fantastic talk today on liver transplantation in alcoholic hepatitis. Should LDLT criteria be different from DDLT? Professor Sarin, for your talk, sir.
Thank you, Abhay, and thanks, Sanjeev, for these very generous words. I sometimes feel there are gems, then there are emeralds, and there are diamonds. And I was lucky to have all three kinds of fellows who have enriched me. And thanks, ISOT, for inviting me. I will just share is my screen visible to you by any chance?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I bring greetings from ILBS, which has been lucky to have very nice young faculty and brighter residents all these years. I would try and cover this 15 minutes into liver transplant. I know I'm in the midst of surgeons as well as other experts in ancillary branches, and of course hepatologists. Many of this would be known to you. Spectrum is cirrhosis, acute on chronic liver failure where there is jaundice, coagulopathy, ascites, and or HE, and alcoholic hepatitis, moderate and severe. Alcohol-associated liver diseases as a cause of cirrhosis, this you can see is India. and this is blue, which is alcohol. You can see that 20 to 30% all over Asia is alcohol associated liver diseases. Some countries are more.
Sir, could you put your slides on slideshow if it is possible, sir?
Is this okay?
Thank you, sir.
Now, how do you define alcoholic hepatitis? You all know, but person is drinking, his bill is above 3, and remember AST is higher than ALT but less than 400. INR is high and neutrophils are there. For severe, generally I would take a bilirubin above 5. Severity needs to be assessed. We do it by what is known, famous, still most popular is the discriminant function, which uses bilirubin and INR. If it is more than 32, high mortality. You also use MELD score. Now MELD 3 can be also assessed. To my favorite is Glasgow alcoholic hepatitis score, which I think has best outcomes as far as non-steroid and other group of patients. You use Lille score as a dynamic score, which is from 0 to 1. If it is more than 0.45 at day 7, it means there is no steroid response. If it is less than 0.15, it is very good response. In between doesn't make much difference. What is the rationale? We suppress inflammation by steroids, by anakinra, FMT, GCSF. We prevent infection, immune modulate. We remove toxins, exchanges, and stimulate liver regeneration by different means. We are talking about when all these rationale and treatments are not working. At ILBS, I could get some recent data about 1,300 odd patients. Steroid eligible were about 22%. Steroid responders of the eligible were 66. But you can see that majority of the patients, half of them, were neither eligible for this or for that. This is an algorithm which I worked hard to develop, and you can criticize and comment on this. Severe alcoholic, not moderate, which is less than 32, DF, you will have nutrition. You identify in the 1 week period in sepsis, give antibiotics, antifungals, steroid eligibles, give them, steroid no response or steroid ineligible, these group of patients will either go on to GCSF or fecal microbial transplant or plasma exchange. Some of them may directly go for liver transplant. This is in first 48 hours. Remember how we can treat now. This is first week. This is first month. Those who respond to steroids do well. Those who do not respond to steroids, which is 40%, 4 out of 10, they have much higher mortality. And this is the Lille score. Now, those who do not respond to steroids, we have one option in very carefully selected paper, which Dr. Shastri showed. If you give GCSF, 2 out of 3, but otherwise 4 out of 5 will die. This is Ebbe's seminal work where he showed that if you use FMT, the guys who survive till the end of 1 year are about 2/3. 87%. But if you take a controlled group, matched group, survival is only 33%. So FMT can be a benefit. It dampens the inflammation. But he used in steroid ineligible, and subsequently several studies have been done. But FMT takes time, and you have patients who may die in first 48 or 24 hours, or may die in 4 weeks' time. So what is our current protocol? Severe alcoholic hepatitis, he has no response, or he is ineligible due to high DF, AKI, or sepsis, he goes to liver transplant. If he has some problems, cannot, then nutrition and supportive care. Then you assess for psychological, social support. If it is inadequate, experimental therapies. If it is excellent, he can be a candidate for liver transplant. And we need to identify this cohort. Now comes the basic core of the talk. Right patient for liver transplant, DDLT or LDLT. So I'll divide it into recipient criteria and challenges. So why abstinence is good? Allows liver to recover, may in fact obviate need for LT. Commitment to abstinence can be visible, and you can implement relapse prevention strategies, which can be done in 3 months. In fact, no difference in longer versus 3-month abstinence. So these are the criteria which are approved and agreed upon by many societies, including ASLD. Now, there are a couple of things which you have to see. First, liver decompensating event. If the guy has couple of times decompensated, he is not a good candidate. Second, psychosocial profile. It must be favorable. And of course, non-response to steroids or high MELD score. Exclusion criteria are very well known to you. So these are guidelines. What ALE guidelines has shown that 6 months abstinence is not necessary. In fact, you can do at an earlier date if these criteria are filled. Now, this is the work by Philippe Mathurian. All of us know about it, where he included first event, Lille score high non-responder, increasing MELD, supports are good. He agrees for lifelong abstinence, and consensus by all members of the team are there. And with that criteria, only 7.7% were eligible for liver transplant. Now, if you have such carefully selected group of patients, then your survival is 77%. Otherwise, 30%. Now, this was put on to a kind of assessment criteria in the US. 100 alcoholic hepatitis patient given steroid, 62 responded, 38 non-responders. Finally, only 3 were able to go for LT. So you can imagine how restrictive criteria are. So these were people who were non-responders. But if you take people who were never steroid eligible, then the group will be large. However, this is a small group, and we therefore need to say not everyone goes. Now, what is the public perception? In this very interesting study, out of 155 respondents, why organ donation, that is DDLT group, people are not willing to give because they think the recipient will indulge again, and this indulgence will lead to a graft which will die fast. Now comes to the donor part. I've told you about recipient. Now in donor, we have very limited husband, wife, mother, maybe sister, daughter, son. Very limited family members. Now there is a negative effect on the family. The guy has been drinking for 10 years, has never bothered to come home on time and spends all the money. Family is unhappy. The wife may in fact have to give because of the father-in-law, the coercion. We have to be very careful that there is no negative impact of long term by forcing them to donate. So any kind of coercion has to be avoided. Of course, donor safety. Now, I'm giving you situations which we have faced. There is a donor, the spouse has given, both can sometimes die. This hasn't happened here, but both can die. But this has happened. The spouse has given and the recipient has died. Now, she's all alone. What can you do now? The family is bankrupt, and then they feel that those who have gone back to drinking, there is a betrayal. So the doctors have to face the betrayal. So be careful that these scenarios can occur. Then you are using a small graft in a high MELD patient, and this is not sometimes what you want to do. There are several barriers of doing an LDLT in alcoholic. These are what I also agree, lack of a protocol. You know, all over India, we don't have an agreed protocol, and I think the societies must work together. Well, we also have selection of right candidates by psychosocial support. This is poor in India. Psychiatrists sometimes will give you a go ahead. So we have a DMD addiction who looks into all these problems. And finally, they don't get an insurance approval. These are challenges. The prerequisite, therefore, for LDLT is that nearly no risk of recidivism should be there. We must try to ensure to overcome donor challenges, family challenges, society challenges, and of course, your own safety as a team. This is the workup which is recommended by Ashwini and the whole group. Recipient workup. One of the important points which we sometimes forget is independent evaluation by hepatologist, surgeon, anesthesiologist, and social work teams. And of course, donor workup has to be very carefully done. Outcomes. These are some of the seminal studies. Number of patients, this you all know, the Lees study, Accelerate H. I want to show that with all these baseline, you have a survival which is 85 to 90% or so. And the harmful alcohol relapse in 1 year can be as high as 40% and 15% can be harmful. Now, this is a study by Avi's group here, and Sanjeev was part of it, and I want to read it with you. In this, for India, this was 2018, 39 patients. Here it says they have compared these 39 with alcoholic liver disease patients. The hepatitis patients were younger, had a higher Child's, higher MELD score. Post-op complications, infections were higher, and fungal infections were more. And the recipients, 15.7 versus 12.8, there was no major difference. There are challenges, but the outcomes can be good. Recidivism, graft dysfunction, and mortality. Just to give you the idea, this is a very interesting study. I want you to pay attention to the red and to the purple. It shows you that 8.2 is the number. There are frequent binge drinking guys. This is the guy who is category 2. These are frequent and binge group. This is, you can see how these guys are drinking, and they start within a month or two. These are non-frequent, non-binge. They are flat, but some of them can come up later. The important part is this group, which can start within 3 months' time. Now, this was about 8% in their total population. This was 15. 23% of the people, 1 out of 5 at least, can have this kind of a behavior. Now, if you take 1 million people and follow them up, the outcome data says those who start drinking early, they are within 1 or 3 months, then you can see that average expected life will be just about 1.5 years or so. If this is what you want to give for your patients, don't do transplant. This is what we want to give, 15 years of life to our patients. This is what the survival is in the group of patients who start drinking early. So there are treatment challenges. The disease is very progressive. I have seen when patients were being referred up to 59, 65 bilirubin, very rapidly progressive disease. The reason for progression post-transplant alcoholic liver disease is primarily a rapid fibrosis because of immunosuppression, sinusoidal obstruction syndrome, veno-occlusive disease, as well as a disease in the parenchyma. Sometimes you have a bland, high bilirubin and low AST/ALT, sometimes a very aggressive florid hepatitis. And this is because patients are on steroids sometimes or immunosuppressants. There are limited chances of second LDLT. There are several scores, you are all aware of these, the HRAR score, the Geneva model. I am very happy with the SALT score, 10 drinks at presentation or more, their prior failed rehabilitation, any history of prior alcohol related legal issues or cannabinoid use. If it is more than a score of 10 or 15, then you're certainly in trouble. Less than 5 is good. Now this study shows you that what happens if the guy drinks. So out of 1800 or 1900 patients, LT for ALD was 712. Severe alcohol relapse occurred in 18%, 128. Those who got recurrent alcoholic cirrhosis versus no recurrent alcoholic cirrhosis, you can see death is nearly 2 times more. Here you have severe relapse and recurrent alcoholic cirrhosis. These patients die. They have a rapid disease and they fall out very soon. They don't even come for follow-up. And this is the Accelerate AH has a dozen of publications. One of them says that if your guy is good, and in their case 90% of guys were behaving well, the survivals can be 1 year and 3 years can be good. But if the drinking comes at 10%, then the survivals will certainly go down. But if you don't transplant, mortality is high. So having said all this, transplant is a good option for these patients. These patients should not be denied whether they go for DDLT or for LDLT. Now this is also to show you, sorry, I missed it. Am I out of time or is that, am I out of time? Oh, can I have one last slide?
Sure, sure, sir.
So this is just to show you that if the patients have, whether they have a overall survival relapse, their survival within 2 to 3 years can go down very. So this is my carry home message. Most important is proper selection of the recipient. Use French, Belgian, Mathurian's criteria, which included only 7% of the total selected non-responders. In my opinion, there is no need to have different criteria for DDLT and LDLT. I think as far as recipient is concerned, we should be same. Wait if you can. In LDLT, we have a twist because donor selection, we have to be extra careful. In DDLT, onus is on society. For allowing a transplant, there is a complete system. But in LDLT, the onus is on surgical team. If something goes wrong, or if the choice is not correct, we are ourselves, in fact, surgical or the transplant team. Thank you, and I'll be happy to learn more on this, and we need more trials on this area.
Thank you, sir, for that very lucid presentation, and you really brought out the points very well. I mean, I've been seeing this, alcoholic hepatitis evolution of the last 2 decades. There would be an element of, bias in LDLT versus DDLT for the selection of patients, which I think should not be there, which you rightly said. Do you think that in DDLT setting, an alcoholic hepatitis patient who's sick, when you list them, like how should they be, competing with the rest of the donor pool, which is a very critical question, sir.
In DDLT, I think they should not be given a higher priority or a lower priority. They should be as per their MELD score and sepsis screening. There is no way we can deny them if all other criteria as listed are fulfilled.
Right. So, any questions from the house or the panelists would be welcome. Because I thought that.
Can I make a point?
No, Dharmesh, yeah, please.
Sir, you alluded to the Mathurin's trial, the first trial, 26 patients, severe ICAP, and who were really non-responder, and they were subject. Actually, these patients, they got an organ in less than 2 weeks of listing. So I think these patients are so sick that if we were not to prioritize them on the deceased donor side, I think though the authors don't mention in this paper, they might have been DRI matched also. They probably would have got the best organs. I think because the mortality is extremely high, it would be difficult to imagine that if they are not prioritized on the deceased donor side, they would end up getting an organ.
I do agree with you that you can prioritize, but you have a priority of ALF, you have a priority of ACLF due to hepatitis B, you have a priority of drug-induced liver injury. Everyone is a priority. So if there is a delay, there is an autoimmune flare with a MELD of more than 27 is a top priority. So how would you be justified in not giving a female an autoimmune flare or HBV flare with a MELD of 35 and switch to an alcohol. All of them are borderline. Alcoholic hepatitis, autoimmune with steroid exposure is as bad. I would say he is on the same platform, yes, but all MELD, same.
I think Share 35 was introduced for that only, sir. I think Share 35 was a very clever move on part of the transplant community so that they could get more and more patients of severe ILF presenting with ACLF to be transplanted quickly.
Dr. Anup showed that very interesting paper where the sepsis, in fact, in that paper, where the ACLF, the only main criteria, 67% of those patients with MELD above 35 could not be transplanted due to sepsis. And the sepsis was due to every other disease, not only alcohol. So I think all these liver failures end up with sepsis.
Right. I think so this debate I think will go on, and I think a lot of new data is needed to actually make solid recommendations. Thank you very much, sir, for that nice talk. I think we'll move on to the next state-of-art lecture, and I would request Dr. Unnikrishnan to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, sir. Indeed, a very informative session. The next topic is State-of-the-Art Lecture, Revisiting Liver-Kidney Allocation Policy, Sequential versus Simultaneous. The chairperson chairing the session will be Dr. Sanjeev Sehgal. The speaker is Dr. Rajkumar Prasidam. I request Dr. Unnikrishnan G, the Clinical Associate Professor, Liver Transplantation, Gastrointestinal Surgery, Amrita Institute of Medical Science, Kochi, to please introduce the speaker. Sir, please.
It's my personal duty to introduce Dr. Rajkumar Prasidam, or since he is from UK, I guess it is Mr. Rajkumar Prasidam, who is a consultant HPB and transplant surgeon in Addenbrooke's Hospital, Cambridge. I had the pleasure of working with him for over a year way back in 2011-2012. Dr. Prasidam finished his MBBS and basic surgical training from Trivandrum and left for UK in 1993. He did his higher surgical training there from 1994 to 2000 in Edinburgh, in Cambridge, and has been a consultant at Addenbrooke's from August 2000 onwards, except for a short stint in Amrita, where he helped in setting up the infrastructure for the transplant program at Amrita, but unfortunately had to go back to England before the program actually took off. He has been involved heavily in the training parts of the UK surgical program. He works very closely with the Royal College, both of Edinburgh and England. He has been an editorial member of the Transplantation Journal. Currently, he is an editorial member of the BJS. His main interests are HPB surgery, liver transplantation, and most importantly, surgical training. He will be speaking on the situation where we all face, whether the patient should get a kidney now or later, and whether you should really invest a difficult organ to get on a patient, 2 organs on the same patient. I welcome Dr. Rajkumar Prasidam on. Thank you.
I kindly request, sir, please unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you're audible. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you for your kind introduction, Unni, especially for putting up that old photograph of mine, must be 15 years older. I'm very grateful to the ISOT organizers for giving me this opportunity. The topic for today, as you can see, is combined liver kidney transplantation. should we be doing sequential kidney after liver or simultaneous liver kidney transplant? I must confess that this is not a topic dear to my heart, simply because I do not believe it's a big problem purely in terms of numbers, and also because it's not possible to be completely objective here. Many of the issues here are going to be ethically based, and as you all know, allocation of a scarce resource can be interpreted differently by different people in different countries who have different healthcare systems. But let me have a crack at it anyway. So how big is this problem? I came across a paper recently from Korea, which mentions some 11 simultaneous liver kidney transplants over the last 20 years amongst some 6,500 OLTs. Now, the situation is different than the United States because it appears that 10% of all OLTs in the US now are simultaneous liver kidney transplant. This has increased from 2.5% from 2001, that is pre-MELD era, to the last couple of years. Now, in the UK, we still are doing a tiny number. I think last year we may have done about 12 out of 1,000 OLTs, maybe 1%. And now when I looked at the national waiting list, there are simply 28 patients waiting for a simultaneous liver kidney transplant. So has there been a change over the years? In the USA, clearly, the introduction of MELD in 2001, 2002 seems to have brought on an increase in simultaneous liver kidney transplants by some 400%. So much so that nearly 10% of liver transplants appear to be simultaneous liver kidneys, which is a huge number, I agree. However, the allocation in the UK is not by MELD score or its UK equivalent called UKELT, which is simply adding in sodium with a different algorithm, but by something called transplant benefit score. Now, I can talk about transplant benefit score. It'll take me a couple of hours to explain it. This is a highly utility-based allocation system, and it's different to allocating through MELD. So maybe that's why we don't do that many. Now, nobody is arguing about the indications for a combined liver kidney transplant. A genetic defect in the liver responsible for renal dysfunction, such as primary hyperoxaluria, atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome, and other metabolic diseases, we all know they need both the organs. Similarly, end-stage liver failure on established long-term dialysis, again, nobody's arguing about the indication for simultaneous liver kidney. But the problem is with patients who have liver failure with associated renal dysfunction. Could be due to hepatorenal syndrome or acute kidney injury or from pre-existing renal disease. It is firstly difficult to know what sort of recovery can happen from these conditions, hepatorenal and acute kidney injury. HRS, particularly type 1, has better chance of recovery than long-standing acute kidney injury. It is often difficult to distinguish between HRS and AKI. A patient should undergo at least a baseline number of tests, which I've listed out there, which includes renal ultrasound, urine analysis, urine electrolyte measurements. But renal biopsies in decompensated liver patients are an entirely different proposition, and most people will not be doing it. So what are the arguments for doing a simultaneous liver kidney transplant? There's a huge analysis of UNOS data which shows clear benefit of simultaneous liver kidney transplant in candidates who are on dialysis for at least 2 months prior to liver transplant, or in patients whose serum creatinine is greater than 2.5 milligram per cent. So here, the 1 year and 5 year survival, patient survival, was statistically significantly better for SLKT. Another advantage, maybe theoretical, is that it avoids the immunological complexities of implanting 2 organs from different donors. Now, here is a Kaplan-Meier curve showing a difference in the 5-year patient survival between liver transplant alone versus simultaneous liver kidney transplant. And you can see at 5 years, there is a statistically significant difference. I can provide any number of these charts from the literature to prove the superiority of one over the other. That doesn't mean that that is the right thing to do. Now, this is probably, I'm happy to be corrected, this is probably the only meta-analysis available. That too, the meta-analysis is not on any good randomized trials, but it's simply a meta-analysis. In this slide, you're looking at the mortality risk, patient mortality risk at 1, 3, 5 years, that is A, B, C, between liver transplant alone or sequential versus simultaneous liver kidney transplant. As you can see in A, B, and C, there is possibly a trend towards better outcome with simultaneous liver kidney transplant, but there is no statistically significant difference in mortality at 3, 5 years between liver transplant alone or simultaneous liver kidney transplant. However, at 3 years, there seems to be a definite increase in liver graft loss when transplanted on its own. Now this is, I'm looking at B, the second forest plot. This is highly statistically significant with a p-value of 0.0001. So liver graft survival appears to be dependent on whether it is transplanted on its own or with the kidney in the presence of renal dysfunction. I'm not saying anything new here. We know this already, particularly when we know that serum creatinine forms an integral part in calculating MELD and UCAL scores. What we do not have is the ability to reliably and consistently predict renal recovery in patients with decompensated liver disease. This is further complicated by an inability to achieve kidney transplant in timely fashion after liver transplant if renal impairment occurs postoperatively in a liver transplant. In the absence of a renal living donor, the average waiting time for a deceased donor kidney transplant is over 5 years in the US. This has resulted in a propensity to err on the side of caution and list liver transplant candidates with significant renal impairment for simultaneous liver kidney transplant. However, I do believe that this has been dealt with by a policy change in the last couple of years, so that in the United States, there is priority given for such patients to be on the kidney transplant waiting list to receive a kidney transplant in a much shorter period. What are the arguments for sequential liver transplant? They are rather obvious. You're not obviously dipping into the kidney transplant pool unnecessarily by giving the kidney to a liver patient. Now, one of the facts is that in every liver transplant, there is an ongoing reduction of renal function post-liver transplant. So why do you want to give a kidney transplant simultaneously when you can get a better idea of the renal function at a later date? And as I said before, in the US, there are extra points and priority. Yes. There are some broader issues I want to touch upon. In most allocation systems, you will find that multi-organ transplants, whether they are liver kidney, heart lung liver, or multi-vessel grafts with small bowel, are generally given priority over single organ transplants. That means 2 or more organs are going into one recipient, which goes against the ethical principle of utilization. It has been demonstrated that kidney transplants used for simultaneous liver kidney transplant have a decrease in kidney graft survival of approximately 1 year compared with if the same kidney was used in a kidney transplant alone candidate. So you could say the kidneys are being used inappropriately from that sense, outcome sense. As I mentioned before, post-liver transplant renal function can go down by up to 10% per year, an average of 18% over 3 to 5 years. Now, the other important thing is, and I know this for a fact, that the best organs go to multi-organ donors, the multi-organ recipients. Kidneys from better quality donors are allocated to simultaneous liver-kidney transplants. This graph shows the outcome of simultaneous liver-kidney transplant based on donor risk index. The top line shows the best outcomes, and those are the ones with the lowest scores with the donor risk index. In fact, you could argue that some of the best organs are being not only unnecessarily given to simultaneous liver-kidney transplants, but also some of the better ones are being channeled that way. Now, this, I believe, is a good listing criteria for simultaneous liver-kidney transplant. This is the US listing criteria. So there has to be the need for maintenance dialysis for at least 6 consecutive weeks before. Acute kidney injury with a calculated eGFR of less than 30 for at least 6 consecutive weeks, which has to be properly documented every 7 days, or a combination of acute kidney injury and dialysis criteria for at least 6 weeks. I think this is a good starting point. It is well known that in these patients, there is near 0% chance of any useful renal recovery. So I do believe that these patients should clearly have the benefit of simultaneous liver-kidney transplant for a number of reasons: better graft survival, earlier transplant, immunological reasons, etc. The main issue with this policy, particularly from a renal point of view, is that a liver failure patient achieves a singular GFR of less than 30 mils per minute prior to listing, he goes into the list. Now, you wouldn't do that if a member of the general public has a eGFR of 30, because most centers would agree that to be on the kidney transplant waiting list, you need to have a GFR of less than 20 mils per minute. Now, the reason why it's kept at 30 is that there is a feeling that there is a high rate of kidney failure in liver transplant recipients, particularly with a eGFR of less than 30. And it appears to be a reasonable cutoff, and I think I do agree with it. Now, there is a new safety net provision in the United States whereby liver transplant recipients who develop renal failure may receive a kidney transplant afterwards, quicker, minimizing the deleterious effects of post-liver transplant kidney disease. So when they develop end-stage renal disease, they are prioritized. I'm not quite sure of the exact mechanism of prioritization, but I believe that they have some exception to the usual MELD score. I'll briefly mention the UK allocation policy. There's a definite hierarchy in the offering sequence for livers and kidneys. Now, for just to give you a brief outline, the top priority would be super urgent listing for acute liver failure, pediatric patients, pediatric hepatoblastoma, split livers, multivisceral grafts containing small bowel or heart or lungs. So there is a definite hierarchy there. And DBD liver allocation is a national allocation, is based on transplant benefit score. There's a single national waiting list. And as I said to you, we're not going to transplant benefit score, just to let you know that it's a highly utility-based allocation system. Simultaneous liver kidney transplant offer will only come to you if the recipient, if your recipient is at the top 3 in the offering sequence, based on the transplant benefit score for that particular donor. Transplant benefit score has donor details, particular donor details in it, and there are modeling, statistical modeling done to come to a particular thing. I'm not saying it's perfect, but what I'm saying is it'll only be simultaneous liver kidney transplant if your recipient is at the top 3. But again, it'll only come to you if there are no high priority kidney patients for that particular donor, what we call a tier A kidney patient. TRA kidney patient has a matchability score of at least 10, high sensitization status, or more than 7 years waiting. So, unless if there are some of those patients there, then the organs will not come as for a simultaneous liver kidney transplant. Now, I suppose I should briefly mention some of the immunological issues. A simultaneous liver kidney transplant can often deal with awkward HLA matching issues, if people believe in that. The liver has a tendency to clear the class 1 HLA, but its effect on class 2 HLA, AB, DR, DQ, DP, and all that is unknown. More and more work is being done to understand what the matching and mismatching of HLA class 2 has on the liver graphs. So simultaneous liver kidney transplant is better dealing with HLA mismatches. Equally, a sequentially run kidney transplant may have to deal with increased levels of sensitization brought on by blood transfusion virological mismatches at the time of the initial liver transplant. The patient who was non-sensitized could become unsensitized, highly sensitized, thereby finding it very difficult to get an organ. So it's important that when someone is being considered for a liver kidney transplant, simultaneous or sequential, that we involve tissue typing team in the discussion who can add valuable information based on HLA antibody screening. As I said before, at the end of the day, you're battling within conflicting ethical issues here when dealing with allocation of scarce resources. Here we are talking about not enough organ donors for everyone. So organs are a scarce resource. How do we allocate them? But this is true for any other condition in our healthcare systems. And this is true for different healthcare systems across the world. Doesn't matter whether it's in the US, Europe, or India, they are scarce. And resources have to be allocated in some decent fashion. But often you're battling between the ethical principles of utilization, where you would want to transplant two different patients, benefit two different patients with a liver and kidney, and not give the to a single patient. But then, is that fair to an individual patient with both kidney and liver failure who has contributed to society equally? Is it fair to deny that patient a combined transplant? Are you not breaching the principles of autonomy and justice? Unfortunately, there has to be a compromise in any allocation system where scarce resources are involved. So in summary, careful discussion needs to happen when a combined liver kidney transplant is listed. This will require nephrology, hepatology, tissue typing, and surgical input. Consider a simultaneous liver transplant if the eGFR is less than 30. I think adopting the EOS guidelines are a good starting point. Patients are best served by a simultaneous liver kidney transplant if the eGFR is less than 20. No allocation system is perfect. Absolutely not. All allocation systems struggle to compromise between the ethical principles of utility, utilization, justice, fairness, autonomy, etc., etc. It's important that clinicians understand this and are acutely aware of this when listing patients for either simultaneous or sequential liver kidney transplant. All allocation systems should be monitored on a 6-monthly basis, not just for outcomes, but also for transparency, fairness, and equity of access. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Raj, for that wonderful lecture, and you really brought out the points very well. I think a lot of it depends upon the place where you are practicing, and also perhaps the practice between a DDLT versus an LDLT center may also impact this decision. So, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. But again, some of the ethical principles are involved. So for instance, in the UK, if you have the listing criteria for both LDLT and DDLT are the same. You might ask why. That's because if, for instance, your graft develops hepatic artery thrombosis, the DDLT patients have access to to a super urgent listing and a further liver transplant, and they get the highest priority. But if we say LDLT should be really out there, anybody can have a LDLT as long as they bring a donor, then suddenly you find that access is blocked. You don't have enough of super urgent livers to give everybody who has a LDLT. So again, you're absolutely right. The healthcare systems are different, and the principles, the interpretation of ethical principles are different in different countries.
Right, thanks. So the talk is now open for questions and comments from anybody on the panel. And in your practice, do you consider doing renal biopsies in those liver patients who are having this confusion whether the kidney should be transplanted or not, and there's a bit of doubt and dilemma? So do you practice kidney biopsy in these patients on wait list?
I would love to. I would love to if I can find somebody brave enough to biopsy it. But most people, nephrologists would, well, at least our nephrologists would shy away from biopsying, and they will come out with a statement saying that this patient has been on AKI or on a filter for the last 8 weeks. There is near 0% chance there's going to be any recovery. And once you have that view, there's no point in pushing for it. So in our practice, we don't biopsy regularly.
Yeah, they're absolutely right, because I mean that's something which nobody would like to do, and I wish there were more or better quality biomarkers. We keep learning about in every talk in IOCT and all, we learn about newer markers for renal prediction of recovery and all. I think we have better markers which can actually tell us in future whether a kidney would pick up after transplant. I've actually seen many patients who had kidney were actually GFR was only 20 pre-transplant due to the liver transplant, and then they pick up and post-operatively they do well. So I think that there is a gap in knowledge at this. That's my personal feeling. There is a gap in knowledge, and perhaps better biomarkers should come which can tell us that this kidney would function after a successful liver transplantation alone if it is done.
Couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Sehgal.
Thank you so much. It was absolutely delightful to have you and your wonderful presentation. And I think we have run out of time, and I will again thank all the speakers for this wonderful talk and in the session, and I will close this state-of-art lecture and pass off the podium to the next session, which is on transplant oncology dilemmas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Next, we'll be dealing with transplant oncology dilemmas. The chairperson for the session are Dr. Biju Pottakat and Dr. Dinesh Jyothimani. Dr. Dinesh Jyothimani could not make it due to unavoidable circumstances, so the session will be chaired only by Dr. Biju Pottakat. Dr. Biju Pottakat is Professor Surgical Gastroenterology, JIPMER, Puducherry. The chairperson will be the same for the next consecutive 4 topics. The first topic will be live donor liver transplant for colorectal liver metastasis. The speaker for the same is Dr. Ravi Mohanka, Chief Surgeon and Head of Department, Liver Transplant and HPB Surgery. He has performed more than 1,500 liver transplants, including India's first successful intestinal transplant and several pioneering transplants in Western India. Over to you, sir.
Biju, with your permission, can I share the slide?
Yes, please proceed. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And if you can see my slide, I'll start off then.
Yes, we can see. You can start. You are audible.
Wonderful. So generally, when we have a primary colorectal cancer, about 50% of them are present with liver metastasis, and about 75% of these have inoperable liver metastasis. And these are the patients that we currently try to either take to resection with either a 2-stage procedure or ALPS, or expands the liver resection criteria, or try to do a liver transplant. So this is the group of patients where this question of whether a liver transplant should be offered or not is being discussed.
Dr. Ravi, can you sit a little bit closer to mic?
Yeah, sir. Now is it better?
Yeah, now better. Yeah.
Right. So what is clear is from literature is that patients who are able to undergo resection for colorectal metastasis, they do much better than patients who are unable to undergo resection. And this is with chemotherapy, they do not do as well as patients who are able to undergo resection. Now, patients who are inoperable to begin with, that is where in case of resection, we are trying to offer a liver transplant, and that's the topic of discussion for today. So the reasons for inability of resection could be multiple tumors, could be extrahepatic metastasis, could be number of lesions which are more than 5 and in bilover, progression of tumor after chemotherapy, or chemotherapy associated steatohepatitis which does not make it safe for us to do the resection. Now, while chemotherapy will make it resectable only in about 10 to 15% cases, the other options as two-stage hepatectomy, portal vein embolization, ALPS, or a liver transplant could be considered. Now, there are several studies in this area. The 2 or 3 main studies with more than 10 patients are going to be discussed in details among these. This is from a meta-analysis published in 2017. Was 89%, but the recurrence again was 70%. The 2 landmark studies that have paved the way for this modality is SECA-1 and SECA-2 studies. There are SECA-3 studies now underway. So basically what they found is that the 1-year survival and 5-year survival are actually quite acceptable, and the disease-free survival again was 35%, which means about 65% recurrence. This led to formation of the Oslo score, which is used to select patients who may be more suitable for transplant with colorectal metastasis. Subsequent international study comprising of 12 patients had 50% survival at 5 years with 50% recurrence. The SECAS-2 study, which again had 21 patients, had 5-year survival of 83%. And again, the recurrence rate was similar at around 65%, but that led to the development of what is called as a FONG score. So the Oslo score is identified risk factors such as lesion more than 5.5 centimeters, CEA more than 80, progression on chemotherapy, and time for resection to transplant less than 24 months. With these, the patients did not do well. The metabolic tumor volume, which is calculated on the PET scan, if it was more than 70 of all lesions which have at least 40% of the SUV max, which is the SUV of the tumor itself, would be calculated in the calculation. And if it was less than 70 grams, then these patients did well. The third one, the FONG score from the SECA-2 study, found that node positive primary, interval of diagnosis to transplant less than 12 months, more than 1 liver metastasis, CA more than 200, and diameter more than 5. These are the patients who did not do well. Now, if we combine all these 3 criteria, mean tumor volume less than 70 cubic centimeter, FONG score of 0 to 2, and Oslo score of 0 to 2. Now, these are the patients who really did well in a recent analysis in the long term also. Now, the positive predictive factors for were like as in the last slide, Oslo score was 0 to 2, mean tumor volumes less than 70, FONG score of 0 to 2, time to diagnosis to transplant less than 3 years. Negative predictor factors, right-sided primary tumor, excessive tumor load, progressive disease, M2 status of the primary, and poor performance status. Now, some of these risk factors are modifiable. The red ones are not modifiable and the blue ones are modifiable. So our goal is to convert these modifiable risk factors to less severe so that these patients fall within the Oslo and the FONG score. And if we could achieve that, then it's a good idea to offer transplant to these patients. So with these criteria, there are some recent reports from mostly European countries, which has very good 1-year and 5-year survival, better than the previous ones. However, the recurrence rates are still similar between 60 to 70%. One of the reasons why this protocol was started in Norway for the first time. Both SECA 1 and 2 studies were done in Norway because they had organs in excess of what they needed for their transplants. Now, this situation is very unlikely to happen in any part of the world in the recent future. But then this was the reason, and when you have a situation like this is the time to actually think of offering it to patients for transplant. There are several ongoing studies to answer several more questions, because in the past the SECA 1 and 2 study only looked at chemotherapy before the transplant, but there are several loco-regional therapies that could be used before the transplant. There are several studies to address this question. The other findings, such as the BRAF mutation, has also been identified as a significant risk factor for poor progression of these tumors, and therefore there are several tumor studies that are trying to address this question. The other question that is being asked is whether a living donor transplant should be offered to these patients, and unfortunately there are no real studies to answer this question. And so this is the SECA 2 study, which has evolved the FONC score, but then it is still enrolling, and it will complete its 25. The TransMed study being done in Paris, the SECA 3 study. Now this will allow all interventions, not just chemotherapy, to be offered to patients before the transplant, so that will probably give us a more real world view of what is best possible for these patients. And similarly, the upfront chemo is offered to all patients with unresectable disease. Patients with poor response to chemo will also be poor candidates for transplant. Liver transplant for colorectal liver mets is safe, although it should be offered to very selected patients with good survival possibility, but accepting a high risk of recurrence. So therefore, it's not a curative treatment. Role of post-transplant chemo is not clear, especially in partial graft, because it may impair regeneration. A shortage of disease donor and offering a living donor transplant to these patients may be a limiting factor, because these are not curative treatments. So after having gone through recent literature, personally, I believe that liver transplant for colorectal liver metastasis is not really ready for prime time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi, for the crisp and to the point summary presentation. And before inviting questions from other, I want to ask you this: as you mentioned, the short course chemo and chemo RT before the rectal cancer surgery, it has to do anything with the prospect of transplant, which how it influences?
So, if it is chemo alone has been studied, but chemo plus loco-regional therapy so far has not been studied, and therefore cannot be supported by literature. Therefore, but if they have the Oslo score less than 2, FONC score less than 2, and mean tumor volume less than 70 centimeter cube, then these patients are likely to do well with survival of 85 to 90%, but recurrence risk of around 65%.
Okay. Second thing is, you mentioned about the number of lesions as 5 as cutoff. So, can you explain that point more? Is it a very hardcore cutoff for
No, it's not. In fact, it could be, even if it is achieved after a series of resection, that's also fine.
Okay, fine. Yeah. I invite questions from others and other speakers and participants also. Yeah, Dr. Shalin, you have any comments? So you are muted.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes, yes, yes.
So I agree that the last line is the crux of this talk, that we are really not ready for prime time. Yeah, because the trials that you have talked about, we all have gone through that part of the literature. So there have been some encouraging results, but patient selection, it has to be a very, very selected group to show those results which have been showed in those trials that you talked about. And in the Indian setting especially, if you have a recurrence like within a year or so, then it becomes very difficult to explain to the family, especially when living donor is the mainstay of your transplant activity. So I think we need more data, more experience, let more data accumulate, and then we might be able to see, say something more. So I totally agree with what was.
Thanks for the comments. Are there any other comments or questions? Dr. Ravi, please wait for 15 seconds more. Yeah.
Sure, sir. Absolutely. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, if there are no further questions, thank you very much for the good session and to the crisp and to the point. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you, sir.